2.5 Admins, episode 223. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, you've got another plug, Alan. Introducing OpenZFS Fast Dedupe.
Yeah, so this is introing a bunch of work that Clara did that's coming out as part of OpenZFS 2.3, which basically allows us to replace the old dedupe that had all the performance problems with a new version called Fast Dedupe. And so we had Jim take it for a spin and write up the results he saw.
Yeah, the short version is legacy dedupe was really never worth using, and fast dedupe won't be worth using for a lot of the folks who desperately want it, but for some folks, it absolutely will be, which is exciting, and go take a look.
Yeah, link in the show notes as usual. Equinix to shutter their bare metal service in 2026.
Yeah, so as a sysadmin, you wonder what it feels like to find out that, oh, your cloud provider is shutting down. Summer 2026 is not that soon, but at the same time, once they announce that, you know that service is going to continue to get worse and worse. They're definitely not getting any newer hardware between now and when they shut down. And so that's going to be a downhill ride. So while you do have more than a year to move your workload, you're probably going to have to start making plans a lot sooner than that.
That does seem like a reasonable amount of warning, though.
That's the date when they're going to turn the lights out. It's going to turn pretty run down probably before that.
And also, there's a big difference in what seems reasonable when you've got a VM or two at a service doing something important to you versus when you have built infrastructure demanding entire clusters of VMs all operating together, and that's what you need to migrate with a little over a year to work with. I would also be concerned because by and large, the type of folks who are customers of Packet.net and then Equinix bare metal, I would say whatever they're calling it this week, but they're calling it soon to be closed. Anyway, those folks tend to be more demanding users. They're not just looking for like, okay, yes, it booted and I can shell into it. They're looking for, sustained performance levels. They're looking for reliability. And it's a little scarier replacing a lot of infrastructure on that type of provider, especially when it's a forced relocation because the whole thing is shuttering its doors. Because that means lots of people are going to be looking to migrate lots of these services from Equinix to, your soft layer or whoever they wind up going to. And personally, if that was me, I would also have concerns of like onboarding and scaling woes at some of those other providers that are suddenly having to take these giant, gluts of new incoming customers from the shuttered service.
Yeah, I would expect, there aren't that many services that are actually giving you full bare metal. Amazon has something, but it's not quite the same level of bare metal. And yeah, with all of them, I doubt any of them could scale up to take over all of Equinix's customers all at once. And, once you got burned by one service, you might start thinking about, well, we don't want to go to just one other service to replace it. We're going to re-architect everything to split it between a couple of providers or something. And then you hit a whole host of different problems. And, if you were using Equinix, you probably built all your infrastructure around using their APIs to be able to stand up new machines when you needed them and so on. And all of that's going to be different at whatever provider you end up going to. And so it is more than just replacing the hosting. This is specialized hosting that's not necessarily readily available other places. And then there's all the integration and so on. Like, when we used Equinix, it was really nice because we used netboot at XYZ, and we could easily fire up our custom images and get things going really easily. And you got, full access to the IPMI, including like SSH serial service. And if the other providers don't have that, you might not be able to get the same capabilities that you had before.
This is why I actually try to avoid all that stuff. Whatever big provider you go to, even the consumer-focused ones, your Linodes and your DigitalOceans or whatever, who would probably bristle at me saying consumer-focused, but I think we all know what I mean in here. They offer proprietary internal APIs as well, and I avoid the crap out of them because I want to make sure I can migrate my stuff anywhere it needs to go. My own personal friendly message to anybody who has built large infrastructure depending on anybody's proprietary APIs, when those APIs disappear out from under you is, oh, that's so difficult, I'm sorry, but keep in mind, Nelson Muntz also has a message for you, and it's
D-Link tells users to trash old VPN routers over bug too dangerous to identify.
Yeah, so there's a new set of vulnerabilities, so new at this point they don't even have CVE numbers yet, but it turns out D-Link is saying, all of the devices affected by this are already past their end of life. You should just throw them away and buy something new. We are not going to fix this. There is no newer firmware coming. You're shit out of luck.
And now to be clear, for some of these devices, the end of life only occurred in May 2024, but none of these devices were spring chickens in terms of their specifications. This is also an argument for, pay attention to what you're buying. Don't assume that just because the shrink wrap is still in a box in the store that you're actually buying a vaguely new model of a thing. The oldest of these routers that has been discontinued and will not be receiving a security fix is so old it literally has 10/100 wired Ethernet ports, and it's still talking about the 802.11b and 802.11g fallbacks behind its 802.11n Wi-Fi. The newest appearing of these devices was at least gigabit, but again, the built-in Wi-Fi was only 802.11n, not AC, not AX. The whole concept of Wi-Fi 456 was not a twinkle in anybody's eye yet. So be careful about buying the cheapest possible router you can find from whatever third-tier vendor you can find and not caring about anything other than cost. You really should be making an effort to be certain as you can, that the hardware that you're buying is of vaguely modern design.
Yeah, and it keeps bringing up this thing we talked about before with the kind of food nutrition type labels on these type of devices. It's like, what is a reasonable amount of time for the vendor to have to support this and fix security vulnerabilities? In this case, it seems like this device is so old that it's legitimate for the vendor to say, no, you shouldn't still be using that. But at the same time, we've seen other vendors try to, pull support after a year or two. At least these ones are mostly 5 to 10 years old. And these devices have quite the bad track record with security. They've had a lot of vulnerabilities. In the past, those got patched, but the end of the road was earlier this year.
I found it interesting in this Register article that they quoted D-Link as saying D-Link US is prohibited to provide support for these end-of-life products. If you're outside of the US, please contact your regional D-Link office. Many devices on this list have available third-party open firmware. D-Link does not support open firmware, which voids any warranty and is solely the responsible of the device's owner. So they're kind of saying just go and find somewhere on the internet.
I don't think that's what they're saying, Joe. I think that D-Link is just well aware that a lot of people buy their devices explicitly with plans to reflash them with, Tomato or OpenWrt or what have you. And D-Link is just throwing out ahead of everything else, look, we're not supporting you if that's what you've got, period. As for the other part about distinguishing between the US and the rest of the world, I suspect the reasoning behind that is, and you should be well aware of this, there are other parts of the world that have considerably more robust consumer protection laws than the United States does, and they might not be able to just tell somebody in the EU to pack sand if they just bought one of these routers, a year or two ago. Now, this is speculation on my part, but I can't think of any other reason why they would be dissociating D-Link US and saying D-Link US isn't allowed to provide support while implying that it was possible that people in other parts of the world might still be able to. I think they're just forced to in better parts of the world.
Prohibited is such a strange choice of word, though.
It is a strange choice of words. And the other part that I saw is the mention of, it sounds like, if your ISP provided this device, call them. Maybe they're going to do something about it, or maybe they'll pay us to do something about it.
Prohibited isn't a strange choice of words at all if it's coming from the legal department, which is exactly what I'm speculating.
Yeah, but prohibited suggests legally prohibited, not by corporate policy.
No, I think it could be corporate policy prohibits us from supporting you because that would mean we take some liability for this device, and we are very explicitly potting that off and being like, no, it's your problem if you still use it.
Right.
I think it just comes down to lawyer speak either way. And once legal got involved, they're like, look, you cannot, and it's not going to. And lawyers don't really speak in friendly terms of what you should or shouldn't do. They speak in terms of no, you can't, or yes, you absolutely must.
Shall not, and all that.
You shall not flash.
It's not quite the same as the RFC where those specific phrases have specific meanings, so English is terrible.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by ServerMania. Go to servermania.com/Black Friday. ServerMania is a Canadian company with over a decade of experience building high-performance infrastructure hosting platforms for businesses globally. This year's exclusive Black Friday and Cyber Week offers, which are available until December 6th, include a 30% saving on bandwidth for unmetered servers, 50% off per month on L4 GPUs when bundled with specific models, and 25% off their most popular custom dedicated servers. But there's limited stock on those, so don't hang around. ServerMania has up to 20 gigabits per second network speeds in 8 locations worldwide for optimized global reach. They have flexible custom server configurations tailored to unique needs, as well as a personal account manager offering free consultations. With 24/7 live chat support and support ticket response times under 15 minutes, you can always keep your systems running smoothly. Alan's been a happy ServerMania customer for over 7 years, so support the show and join him at a hosting provider that truly delivers. Learn more and secure those Black Friday deals at servermania.com/Black Friday. That's servermania.com/Black Friday. Google cracks down on Parasite SEO, punishing established publishers.
Listeners, have you noticed how frequently you go to search for something on Google and you wind up with these weird little nonsense garbage reviews hosted at Forbes of all places? And it might not necessarily be shopping for electronics. You might be shopping for something like THC gummies and find a list of the best ones to buy at Forbes?
Noted business publication, Forbes, yeah.
So obviously, if noted business publication Forbes wants to tell me the proper THC gummies to purchase and ingest, I should pay attention, huh? At any rate, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about Google cracking down on. Forbes is not the only one, but they're the one that has been the most visible to me personally, at least. A lot of these large, very well-established sites with a ton of Google juice have realized that, I can host relatively high-margin nonsense, for lack of a better word, and take advantage of all the Google juice that I've built off of the other things that I'm doing on this domain, and I can suddenly become the king of CBD gummy recommendations at, very little additional expense. But that's not good for consumers. There is nothing about Forbes that magically makes it the best place to get your weed recs from. So Google's trying to do something to limit the scope of this kind of, for lack of a less awful term, Google juice abuse.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of people that don't understand that just because it's for sale on Amazon doesn't mean it's legit. A lot of these sites are, quote, marketplaces, including, Forbes calls their thing their marketplace or advisor service. And it's basically, we have this space where people come to and we'll let you put your crap for sale here and we'll take a cut kind of thing.
Imagine in a slightly different universe where Zuckerberg had not decided to close off Facebook and try to make all of the content as, non-indexable from the outside as it possibly could. And every time you went to buy anything, you're just wading through mountains of Facebook marketplace nonsense. Maybe we ought to go back and say kinder things about Zuckerberg preventing Google from getting inside of Facebook. Maybe he did us all a solid. Just that one time. I'm not saying we have to like the guy, but maybe just that one time he did us all a solid.
The irony of this, of course, is that it's not really going to improve Google search. They've already ruined it with all the AI bullshit.
Well, not just that. It's like Google just wants to take the money from these CBD recommending people as AdSense instead of it going to Forbes.
I suppose.
Exactly.
Cable companies and Trump's FCC chair agree. Data caps are good for you.
Whereas the FCC last month voted 3-2 to open a formal inquiry into how broadband data caps affect consumers and whether the commission has the authority to regulate how internet service providers impose such caps.
Yeah, but things have changed, Alan. Things have changed.
By the time they go to do that, there won't be the same head of the FCC, so we'll have to see.
Data caps enable innovative plans at lower monthly rates, they say.
Yeah, it's good for consumers, yeah.
I always struggle with this issue when people talk about data caps because most people just act like everything is free and everybody can saturate their line all day long and it doesn't cost anything extra. And that's simply not the case. The realities of internet service provisioning is that, the physical lines are always oversubscribed. That's the way it works. You don't say, well, I have, this many million customers, each of which have, symmetrical gigabit. Therefore, I have to have that many million gigabits worth of bandwidth available. That's not how that works. You oversubscribe your lines and you have a good understanding of like what percentage you can oversubscribe them and what level of service quality your users expect, whether they will tolerate a slowdown during peak hours, based on like what they're paying you and what your reputation is. You kind of massage all this until you come up with a final product that you're happy with. And so I'm not one of these folks that say a data cap is always evil and there should be no such thing. My issue is they never seem to actually make the damn cost go any lower. When you look at one service that's unlimited and another service that has some horribly restrictive, 15 gig data cap on a cellular plan, you usually see almost the same price between the two. When you do see price differentiation, it's usually because after they've started with the data caps, they raise the pricing on anything uncapped. But again, if they were actually offering cheaper, high-quality plans with a cap on them and disclosing all of that stuff up front, I'd be good. The problem is they're not, they don't, and that's not why they want data caps.
Yeah, usually it's just a way to charge people more to have more bandwidth. But the thing that gets me the most is that these data caps never actually solve the problem. To solve the problem, you would have to have kind of like a time of use thing like we have for electricity, where you're trying to disincentivize people to use the internet during prime time when the internet's saturated.
Yes, reward me for my overnight goblin-like browsing habits, please.
Yeah. One provider I had basically had certain hours where your your usage didn't count against your data cap. So the data cap only applied for peak time. And if you used outside of that, then your usage didn't count against your data cap. And that, if people understood it and used it, would have meant they had less congestion at those peak times.
Right, so I'm torrenting my Linux ISOs in the middle of the night then.
Precisely.
To the point where most torrent clients have some concept of you can set different speed limits for a different time of day.
I already was torrenting most of my Linux ISOs overnight just because that was the most convenient way to do it. You set them all up in a batch before you go to bed and you wake up next morning to fresh distributions.
But, with the caps we normally see from most of these places, even with like cell phone networks as well, they are never actually seeming to try to push people to change their habits or to use the internet at a specific time. They are just a way to charge you more money for going over a magic limit that they made up.
Forgive my ignorance as a European here, but in North America, is it common for proper wired home internet to have data caps then?
It is not. It's almost unheard of. It's not entirely unheard of. I've seen it on a couple of DSL plans, typically from smaller providers. But no, for the most part, you really only see that with cellular plans.
For wired providers, it was a thing a number of years ago for quite a while. But then when there was enough competition, especially when we had the wholesale market for internet, it kind of went away and stopped being as much of a thing.
On the other hand, if you would like to see a data cap on a wired plan, just rent a VPS in any data center anywhere, or a bare metal server, or co-locate a server, and you'll very quickly discover very restrictive caps that are extremely expensive when you break them. But for consumer internet in North America, in my experience, it's, again, not unheard of. Like I saw Comcast do it back in the day. I never saw Time Warner Cable doing that, or, then they became Spectrum. I've never seen that on that side, but I've seen Comcast do it. I think I've heard of Verizon doing it, but I haven't directly seen it from them. But again, fairly uncommon. Most people here aren't dealing with that if they've got proper wired internet.
What about cell phone plans then? Because here, it's not unheard of to get unlimited, but you have to pay top dollar for that. It's very common to have, you just pay for how much data you get. Like you get 5 gigabytes with this plan or 20 with this one. And unlimited is relatively unusual.
Providers here are generally, the unlimited plans they're quasi-unlimited. There is still a data cap. The difference is that when you hit the data cap, rather than entirely cutting you off or throttling you down to the point where it's almost entirely unusable, if you have one of the quote unlimited unquote data plans, you get added back in, but all of your packets are at the absolute bottom of the priority queue. So If you live in an area where there actually is excess capacity, then the unlimited plan will probably work very well for you, and you may not even notice any slowdown. On the other hand, if you live in a very tightly packed urban metro area, you may discover that the unlimited plan is worse for you than some of the capped plans because they might start throttling you earlier than, when the cap hit on one of the more expensive capped plans. And once they start throttling you, you're left with just whatever they feel like giving you. There are absolutely no guarantees once you're over that cap and onto the throttled portion of your, quote, unlimited plan.
And, the same goes, especially as Jim was mentioning, if you're at a VPS provider, if there's one that offers unlimited bandwidth, expects it to be contended all the time because everybody who wants unlimited bandwidth is using that one, and they're just, we only have this much pipe and we're just letting everybody free for all it.
That's where the seed boxes live.
Yep. For all those Linux ISOs.
Sometimes you need to download your Linux ISO, in a different country and then download it from there to your house. For reasons.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by 1Password. Imagine your company's security like the quad of a college campus. There are nice brick paths between the buildings. Those are company-owned devices, IT-approved apps, and managed employee identities. And then there are the paths people actually use, the shortcuts worn through the grass that are the actual straightest line from point A to B. Those are unmanaged devices, shadow IT apps, and non-employee identities like contractors. Most security tools only work on those happy brick paths, but a lot of security problems take place on the shortcuts. 1Password Extended Access Management is the first security solution that brings all these unmanaged devices, apps, and identities under your control. It ensures that every user credential is strong and protected, every device is known and healthy, and every app is visible. 1Password Extended Access Management solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. It's security for the way we work today, and it's now generally available to companies with Okta and Microsoft Entra, and in beta for Google Workspace customers. So support the show and check it out at onepassword.com/25A. That's onepassword.com/25A. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Israel writes, I have a Linux desktop at home that serves Samba shares to Windows clients on an MD RAID 4-disk array. Currently there are 4 WD RAID disks, 4 terabyte, 5900 RPM. How dumb of an idea is it to start replacing one disk at a time with 7200 RPM NAS-grade hard disks? Is it a problem to mix hard disk vendors?
It's not a dumb idea at all, and no, it's not a problem mixing vendors. It's also not a problem mixing spindle speeds. In general, your array is going to perform roughly as though it were composed entirely of the slowest drive in the array. So you shouldn't expect to get immediate speed improvements out of replacing your 5900 RPM drives with 7200 RPM drives. And honestly, you're probably not going to notice much of a speed improvement from that, even with all of them replaced. It's still rust. But no, in the meantime, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's the right way to go about it. You replace them one at a time until they're all replaced. As far as sizes, those are also fine to mix, so long as the replacements are larger than the ones that you had originally. Then you just won't have access to any of that additional space until, again, you've replaced all of the smaller drives, at which point you can expand the array into the additional space that has become available.
Simon writes, a question about ZFS. Say I have a RAID Z1 with 3 10 terabyte drives and replace one disk with, say, a 14 terabyte drive. Will the pool consume the whole disk, or can I still use the spare 4 terabytes for something else, non-redundant? I suppose I can make a partition table and just assign a 10 terabyte partition to the pool and give 4 terabyte in another. What would you do? Not that.
Basically, yeah. So, yeah, if you replace one of your 10 terabyte disks with the 14 terabyte disk, giving it the whole disk, then ZFS will use the first 10 terabytes and kind of ignore the rest until you eventually replace the other 10 terabyte disks, and then it will keep ratcheting up every time the smallest disk in the array goes up. It will expose that additional space across that RAID Z1. And so you could do the partition thing and give that 10 terabytes to the existing array and have the other 4 left over. First thing is, Obviously, if it's a 14 terabyte drive, you don't actually have 10 plus 4 terabytes of usable space, but we'll leave that math to you separately. But in general, I wouldn't recommend doing that because what do you really have to put on that extra 4 terabytes? If you need 4 terabytes more space, then maybe you should just replace all 3 of your 10 terabyte disks with 14 terabyte disks and actually have that additional space and have it be redundant, because just trying to use it is not going to help. And I think, as Jim already answered this email privately, anytime you're trying to use that extra 4 terabyte partition, you're going to be slowing down your main array.
And vice versa.
Yeah, and vice versa. And so you're going to make them compete for performance all the time. And because, like Jim just said in the previous question, whenever you have any kind of RAID array, your disks are generally going to act like the slowest disk in the array. So even though that 14 terabyte disk is probably faster than the 10s, as soon as you have a second workload on it in that other partition, it's now probably going to be the slowest and going to drag all the disks down. And so as part of your upgrade, you're going to have worse performance if you're also using the disk for something else. So your best bet is to just use it as a replacement for the 10 terabyte disk, and everything will be fine. And in the future, when you replace the other small disks with bigger ones, you will get the extra space. I'm assuming the reason why you bought a 14 terabyte is because it better cost per terabyte than buying a 10 at this point.
There will be a certain segment of folks who are like, well, I don't really care about the performance part. Performance part is fine. I just need a bunch of space to put stuff on. I don't care about the speed, which is valid. However, if you do what you're talking about doing and you partition off one drive that's larger than the other drives, and you make the smaller partition into a place where you can put some other stuff, and that's not redundant, although the other is redundant, and maybe you don't back that up the same way as you did the other one because the other one's ZFS and this is either not ZFS or a different pool, like you're creating a maintenance nightmare for yourself. At some point in the future, you're not only going to need to replace those other 2 drives, you're going to need to replace that one. And when you replace that one, you not only have to deal with like resilvering the ZFS part of it into whatever pool it's a part of, now you also have to remember to deal with whatever the stuff is on that other partition. And this kind of thing gets out of hand quicker than you'd think, because if you do it once, you're going to do it again in a couple of years, and you're going to do it again, and you're going to do it again. And then at some point, you're just going to have this undocumented, sprawling nightmare that you don't even remember where all the things are anymore. Like, okay, I know where, /disk1 and /disk3 are mounted on my system, but I've kind of forgotten which physical hard drive each one of them lives on. And then you have to puzzle all that out. Don't put yourself through that. The other thing that I will mention, though, about the partitioning, there can be very good reasons to manually partition your drives and only give ZFS part of them. I actually do that with the majority of my ZFS installations because I'm not doing root ZFS. I am booting from small ext4 partitions, usually ext4 on MD RAID. So I'll reserve like 100 gigs off the top of each one of my drives. I'll put an MD RAID 1 of, my very minimal root operating system there, and then the rest of it I feed to ZFS as one large partition. Beyond that, when we talk about feeding the whole drive to ZFS, this is one of the things that I don't see anywhere near as many people understanding as I wish understood this. There actually is no such thing as ZFS getting fed the whole disk. If you just add the entire bare device name when you do a zpool add or zpool create command, what ZFS actually does is immediately partitions it. You get a partition 1, a partition 5, and a partition 9. And the ZFS data goes in the big partition in the middle. The partition 9 stuck on the end, it's actually intended to reserve a little bit of space, so you've got like a hacky way to deal with it. If you wind up trying to resilver in a slightly smaller drive from a different vendor or a different model number that's theoretically 10 terabytes where you're already 10 terabytes, but it's a slightly smaller 10 terabytes, well, then maybe if you get rid of that, partition 9 buffer on the end, maybe that'll be enough to allow you to mix those 2 vendors' drive sizes. But no matter what you do, you are always using ZFS with a partition table.
Not exactly. I've never heard of this partition 5. It's just 1 and 9 that I've seen. And it's different if you use Solaris or FreeBSD than if you use Linux. On FreeBSD, you can do the, quote, dangerously dedicated and have the whole disk be ZFS with no partition table at all. Now, most times on FreeBSD, it does get a partition table manually from the operating system first because you need a place to put your boot code. But it's a little bit different all over, and it's something I'm looking at trying to get ZFS to commonize, because it'd be nice if ZFS just made the partition table for you and did it the same way on every operating system instead of what it does today.
Jonas writes, I'm wondering, what's your opinion on scaling a fleet of FreeBSD hosts with jails? I found Pot have a Nomad driver, and that looks interesting. But is it really necessary, or would you say managing a fleet with Ansible behind a load balancer is sufficient?
So it depends what you're trying to do. So Nomad is what's called a cluster scheduler. And basically, it's about, I have a bunch of FreeBSD hosts. I need to deploy this new jail. I don't want to pick which host it is. I want the cluster schedule to decide which machine has the most resources and should take this workload. And so it is kind of along the same lines as something like Kubernetes. It is, my infrastructure just says, we need this jail somewhere, and have it go and pick which machine is the best place to put it on and be able to possibly move it after and so on. So if you just deploy a fleet of FreeBSD hosts and then want the software to figure out which workload goes where, then using Nomads is a great way to do that. If you want to know a little bit more about how to get started with it, Clara actually has an article on doing cluster provisioning using Nomad and Pot on FreeBSD. So if you want to kind of see what it takes to get started and actually use Nomad and Pot the way they were meant to be used together, then check out the article.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.